Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, I'm Layman Pascal. This is Love the System, which is the integral stage series exploring procedures, practices, protocols, and the proposed principles of higher and deeper teamwork, group intelligence, and human systems. Today, I'm in conversation with Forrest Landry, philosopher of immanent metaphysics, a great lover of trinities, a possible mentat, and through his work on human assembly and ephemeral group processes, among other things, a serious contributor to both the theory and practice of more benevolent, more agile, and more satisfying group behavior. He's someone many of our followers have heard about, but probably not sufficiently explored, and I've personally been looking forward to getting a better feel for him. Hi, Forrest.
Good morning. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Welcome. Yeah.
What I'd like to do is, as I explained to you off camera, use some of the core concepts around human assembly and ephemeral group process as a springboard to get your perspective on some of my concerns in this area, broaden out toward a more free-form exploration at the end. But first, I'd love to give everyone a little bit of a personal taste for how you got into thinking about these things. So where do you start, both in terms of like what in your life led you to grapple with social organization design processes? And also, what are the basic principles or hunches with which you begin such an exploration?
Well, it's kind of an interesting path. I never started off thinking I'm going to do anything in this space. I mean, I basically began in the craft field. My father's a woodworker, so I had a lot of hands-on experience in the shop. And I also grew up in a situation where I wasn't in a religious context. Like I wasn't expected to be part of some church or something like that. So later, as I started to really explore spirituality and, what is all life about and so on and so forth, led into the, why questions.
Yeah.
I really was interested to pull in a lot of the thinking that came from a kind of engineering perspective, because that had clarity, it had a kind of practical effect. And so I just wanted to be able to approach mind and subjectivity and aesthetic questions and even ethical questions, although I didn't know that until later, but at least aesthetic questions. Yeah. From a very functional, practical point of view, with the kind of math and science that normally helps us to figure stuff like that out. And so I did a kind of literature search and not finding anything. At a certain point, it became apparent to me that if I wanted to be on the cutting edge, I kind of had to either go find people that were doing that, but I lived in Maine, so that wasn't really an option, or to just try to do it myself, to create something. And so I, at a certain point, basically really dedicated my life to that. Basically said, this feels like it's worthwhile. It feels important. It feels like the kinds of questions that if they're meaningful to me, they're probably meaningful to other people. But I wasn't, again, thinking about it in a kind of larger sense. I was just thinking about it in the sense of, I want to know. And so that was kind of the beginning. And that commitment to what is the truth? How do we know anything? Really led me to explore the foundations of a lot of different conceptual systems. And at a certain point, I sort of started to see these patterns. I started to notice things that kept recurring in a lot of academic literature, and basically, this time probably, college or late college, university time period, I was doing obviously a lot of studying. And I very much found myself really wanting to get clear about these underlying patterns that I was seeing. I was like, what is this? And how do we apply this information? Like, what does this mean? And the metaphysics grew out of that inquiry. It grew out of that process. And there's a whole lot of computer science process that made that possible, because the internet was just beginning to really be the case. So the signal to noise ratio was excellent. I mean, a lot of academic literature out there, a lot of really deep spiritual literature, and it was all just sort of emerging in the field. There wasn't a lot of advertising or market-based process, or people basically doing the social media kind of narcissistic stuff that you see today, and politicize everything and weaponize this and that and so on. So in effect, I was using the underlying material to create this really deep body of knowledge that has become the immanent metaphysics. And from there, really started thinking about, well, how does this apply to individual person's life? So that's where the ethics came in, right? The ethics is essentially a side effect of the metaphysics. And so all of a sudden I noticed that I was in possession of these tools that could answer really difficult and challenging ethical things in ways that just really were actually in some respect quite novel, like to identify whole classes of questions that nobody had even really thought of before, or if they were thinking about it, didn't really have the tools to be able to address. So my first inclination was to apply all of that to how does an individual make good choices in life. So after the Immanent Metaphysics book came the Effective Choice book. And it was meant to be something that individual people could use on a day-to-day basis, or at least help them to navigate the kinds of issues associated with want, need, and desire and all that sort of stuff. So a bunch of time passed. Most of that work was completed around 2001. And I was working for the government at the time. I was basically contracted to DARPA and the Pentagon and other three-letter agencies and so on, and was doing some pretty deep architectural work in search engine design and how to think about distributed systems and large-scale architectures and stuff like that. So I really got a deep integration with that kind of engineering practice. Then a little later on after that, I kind of burned out, got just way too much stress, way overload. And so as a result of health kind of issues and crisis associated with that, I kind of reset my life. I went back to my craft. I went back to what I grew up with as an artisanal craftsman. So I started a woodworking company and that's still going. And it was in the course of that I started to really think about how do we apply these underlying concepts, the metaphysics, the philosophy, the ethics, to things like management or business design, or what does it mean to actually be an entrepreneur, and how do we be successful, and what does success actually mean? Not just, in the sense of wealth production, perhaps, but actually in the sense of cultural effects. What kind of effect can a business or a product have on a marketplace, and what can that do to shift, ecological concerns, which are becoming increasingly prevalent in social awareness? So I was very much, and had even to the staff quite openly, described Magic Flight as a sort of experiment. We're doing a social experiment. We're going to start with ordinary people, and we're going to try to do things that are actually quite hard to do, and really explore the relationship between the organic and the inorganic. So Magic Flight as a company was kind of a test bed for the philosophy, which I think at this point was actually a good move in one sense, because it's very rare that an armchair philosopher ever actually tests their philosophy in something as demanding as the business marketplace. That's a very competitive, no holds barred environment. You've got to deal with the real physics, the real politics, actual people in real situations, and philosophy either helps you with that or it doesn't. So in effect, at this point, I now feel like I have very well tested concepts. At least way more than would otherwise be apparent in what would normally just be a fully academic setting, where there's no demand of consequence that either your idea works or people lose their jobs. So in that sense, there was this really strong motion to scale the concepts of the philosophy beyond the individual, and now thinking about teams and thinking about how do communities organize, how do groups of people collaborate, and what's needed to create collaborative process. So I started really thinking about those kinds of issues and applying the ethics at that level and the philosophy at that level, and was actually in a lot of respects quite successful. The one thing I think that was a little bit problematic was the company was just growing too fast. And it really was the case that it takes time to teach people how to use these tools. So while I was able to use them, the coupling of getting my managers to understand how to be better managers using these same tools was actually quite problematic. So Magic Flight went through its life cycle. At this point, it's a small company that's just operating kind of as a boutique business. But meanwhile, because of increasing awareness of existential risk issues, I started to reorganize my life around how to respond to that. And I met some influential people who were already involved in some of these spaces, and a lot of conversations started coming around. So in that respect, I was now sharing my insights about what I discovered at Magic Flight and also the metaphysics itself as applied to existential risk and increasingly civilization design. What would it take for us as a species to endure for the next 1,000 years? What does it take for us to even endure for 300 years, or even get through some of the issues associated with things that could basically wreck the planet, and quite permanently? So in that sense, a lot of these conversations started to get really focused around those kinds of things. And that's sort of how I came to be aware of and at all responsive to the kinds of issues that show up as civ design, community design, governance, and things of that nature. Basically, it's now the application of the ethics and the metaphysics to handle really deep questions associated with things like the Fermi paradox. Why don't we see intelligent life in the universe? Is there some reason that makes it hard for us to see it, either because it's really rare or because, we're the first and where it's out there, but you can't see it because of some sort of, dark wilderness phenomena of predatory behavior and so on. So that's kind of the scope of the journey is connecting all of that together, is just this deep inquiry and the use of, to some extent, formal methods to address some of that inquiry from a toolbox that is, to my knowledge, at least, pretty unique.
Terrific. Thanks for taking us through that. I'm gonna zero in on what I guess is a part or a moment of that journey. Okay. And well, tell me if this sounds roughly correct. You do a kind of survey of the common forms of group decision-making styles. You chunk those into three main types: consensus, meritocracy, and democracy. Each of them has some advantages and some weaknesses. You try to envision a procedural framework that would maximize the advantages and minimize the weaknesses by specifying the circumstances under which each mode would predominate. And your guide to doing this is your metaphysical notion of a fundamental conceptual trinity of transcendental, omniscient, and immanent, which tells you not just which factors to look for, but also the order in which they have to be addressed to produce a multidimensionally satisfying rather than a degenerative outcome. Is that roughly correct?
That is roughly correct. Yeah, the small group essay was, to some extent, it was basically a realization of the use of the tool. It was like, here's what seems to be an impossible problem, right? We have these three different governance styles. They all have substantial disadvantages, real hazards. People have worked with all three of these tools for a long time and just continually run into these issues, even though there's some advantages and disadvantages that are really bad. So now all of a sudden, using this underlying tool was like there was a new way to think about how to resolve this problem. And so writing that essay was essentially my exploration of, first of all, wow, this can actually be done in a completely new way, and that way that we're now thinking of has a sort of balancing function that essentially enables us to get the advantages without the disadvantages. And that to me was just like, it's practically miraculous. Like, this has been an outstanding question for so long, to now all of a sudden be able to say, yes, we have an answer. We have a response that we could do that's practical, can actually work, and completely transforms just how we think about the problem. And so that was not just a hopeful notion, but it was really much an indication of what sort of practices might actually work in a real situation. As it turns out, as we tried to explore, can we scale this up? Can we start to think about this at, say, regional politics rather than just a small team of people? And it turns out there's a lot of issues associated with that. The thing in the small group essay doesn't scale very easily, but it gave us a very strong indicator that there were ways to solve what looked to be completely intractable problems at a political level, at a social physics level, that just had been, for whatever reason, just off the table, never even thought of as practice. And so now there was a lot of inquiry into how do we basically make these same tools work at much larger, post Dunbar, which means groups larger than, say, a few hundred people, large groups, right? How do we get good governance process, things that actually result in health and resilience and, vitality, but thriving specifically both on interpersonal as well as inter-ecological levels. So that became very much the inquiry and the direction, and things like ephemeral group process became answers became at least components of an answer to that question.
Good. I want to trace some of those ideas going forward, especially in terms of the larger scale stuff. But I've got a few my curiosities and concerns around each of these modes, because in order to harness them or go beyond them, it has to be good versions of each of those things.
Yeah.
So for me, one of the outstanding problems with meritocracy is that there's a frequent tendency or even an incentivization for some forms of competence to substitute for the appropriate form of competence in a certain domain.
Right.
So that we see an epidemic of rhetorical skill and private economic cunning and the ability to insulate yourself from the consequences of your actions getting rewarded by society in the market as if those were merit. So how do we make sure the competence implied by merit is actually applicable to the situation or to the collectively desired outcome?
Well, part of it is to sort of recognize that there are domains of action, and to understand the scope of the domain of action where it makes sense, so that you can also understand the scope of action where it doesn't make sense.
Right.
So, for example, the kinds of things that are really, really good for increasing sustainability are not necessarily the kinds of things that are really, really good for increasing evolution capacity, i.e., evolution would say, I want to change, right? Evolution creates change, whereas sustainability is mostly an absence of change, right? So in effect, you now have these two forces kind of pulling against one another, because you need both. You can't have perfect staticism, but also you can't have perfected evolution, because then without sustainability, it doesn't last. So in effect, the notion here is that in the same way, and this comes from a sort of computer science perspective, but an engineering one typically, have each tool do its job really well. If I'm going to make a hammer, I want to make it a certain way, and it's going to make a terrible screwdriver. And if I want a screwdriver, I'm going to make that a different way than a hammer. And, honestly, every tool wants to be kind of designed for purpose so that it's effective at what it's doing. And if I try to use something like a Swiss Army knife for all tasks, I'm probably going to be unsatisfied with everything. So in this sense, what we're basically saying is that there are circumstances where you want to give resources to the person that's more effective, more efficient, or more capable of solving certain kinds of problems. Business development or creativity is needed for creating new products or solving problems in the world, and so on and so forth. At that point, it's kind of a return on investment question. You obviously want to have that work. But at the same time, when we're thinking about things like justice, you don't want it to be contingent upon how much money you can throw at it. Like, if you're actually looking to answer a question of, is this person guilty? You need the right answer. You don't want to have them sit or in life or, some sort of capital punishment kind of thing, and then discover later that, oh, well, it was just because we happen to pay this guy, and this guy is just really, really good at using rhetoric. And so he convinced these people to misunderstand the situation and just overlook the actual reality. And so in a certain sense, what we're basically saying is that we want the merit of the logic, not the merit of the skillfulness of the rhetoric to be the thing, and not just the logic, but the evidence, right? That you want to have a genuine encounter with the truth, because otherwise, we're blind, right? If we don't have actual awareness of the world, it's sort of like everything is sudden to the blind. If I'm a dancer, I can't see the other dancers. Yeah. There's going to be collisions, and I won't know that collision is going to happen until the instant of contact, because I can't anticipate. So in this sense, the notion here is that if we're looking for meritocratic type process, we're mostly looking at it in the kinds of ways in which creativity would essentially be the fundamental reason. Whereas if I'm looking for things which have to do with protecting the land and the people, right? If we think, what is the function of government? Well, the first order, it's to protect the land, because if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to have crops and no food means no people. Then after that, you want to protect the people, because without the people, you don't have anything. You don't have a governance. You don't have, consciousness. You just have an empty field, basically. So in this particular sense, we can say, well, more than just a protective function, a sort of sustainability function, we also need a thriving function, because if the land's sick and the people are sick and they're all miserable, I mean, you kind of look back and you say, what's the point, right? So somewhere along the way, we basically say, well, what is it that we really care about? What is it that we really value? What are the things that matter to us, that we strive for innately and cognitively for to realize in the depths of life. So in this sense, what we're getting at is, the kinds of value systems, the kinds of things which help us to make choices towards thriving. And when we think about thriving, we're thinking about it in a holistic way, because we don't want it to thrive just today. We want it to be thriving tomorrow and for our children and for their grandchildren and so on down the line, right? So in effect, what happens is that we therefore have a kind of holistic conscientiousness about thriving that has an effectiveness, which is of a completely different order than that which would be associated with, say, a meritocracy designed purely around some sort of output function. And the more efficient we get with the meritocracy, the more one-dimensional it gets, the more that the metric becomes singular, and to some extent, the complete antithesis of the robustness that holistic thinking would actually need. If I have something that's really powerful but incredibly brittle, it'll maybe work once, but after that, it's kind of a loss. And if I have something that's super robust but no effectiveness, then I've also got a situation. So therefore, we partition the domain. We basically say, for, how many domains do we have? What are the nature of the things that work really well in those domains? And how do we really understand the connections between them? And to some extent, disconnections. So for instance, the last thing I want to do is to make fairness a market proposition. I mean, yes, we need fairness if we're going to have competition in the marketplace, but the notion of fairness transcends market. There's a deeper order to that, which is not something that can be purchased for any number of dollars. The same way that I can't walk to a corner drugstore and purchase growth or healing. I can purchase medicine, but I got to rely on my body to do the work. So in that sense, we really want to understand the fundamental dynamics of the interconnections that, to some extent, define how these things work, so that we know what effectiveness and efficiency is in each domain. That's basically the direction I would go with that.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say it's a delight to have someone actually have an answer to questions like these, because I often bring up my curiosities, and it's usually people go, oh yeah, that's a really good question. And they don't have a proposal.
Yeah.
So I just love that there was an answer there. That's a beautiful thing.
Well, this is just getting started. I mean, the thing is that there is this whole series of questions. Like this question leads to more questions. Yeah. And those questions lead to even more questions. So at this point, a lot of this has actually got quite advanced. Just in terms of, just to give you a kind of roadmap, there's literally hundreds of questions of that same scope that have been addressed that largely, I don't actually personally know of very many groups that have been able to make headway on a lot of these kinds of questions. So to me, it's actually kind of fun. You all of a sudden you have this new toolkit that can answer a whole constellation of questions that nobody could ever address before. It's like low-hanging fruit. It's like a Christmas tree party. I mean, everything is glittery and fun and playful and interesting to work with. But at the same time, it's kind of a watershed. There's a lot of goodness that comes out of this. So in that sense, it's quite exciting.
Well, let me throw a couple more of my queries against your toolkit and see if we can get something interesting here. Two things stand out for me about democracy. I'll ask the first one. It's about the role of anonymity in democratic group processes. So obviously we have secret ballot because that allows some people to vote their conscience apart from calculating the social consequences of their vote. And that seems to me like part of a more general kind of rule structure for ensuring that the information in the individual doesn't leak out before it gets to the compiled group decision. And my question is, how broadly applicable is that? Should we, for example, have secret ballot in legislatures where we tell ourselves we want to be able to hold our representatives accountable, but in reality, it's their economic sponsors and their party peers who inspect their votes and to whom they tailor that. Do you think we would get a smarter output from legislatures if they had internal secret ballot?
Well, this is a complicated question for a lot of different reasons. One of which is that what we're really looking at is the sense-making process, right? So it's not the vote so much that I'm trying to get to here. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of questions about, how do we do better voting systems? And lots of people have explored that. But then there's questions of how do we make the kinds of conversations that precede the vote? Like if I'm basically saying, okay, prior to somebody going into a voting booth,
Yeah.
They're doing some research. They're having conversations with their friends around dinner. Or they're basically exposed to all sorts of ideas, maybe by advertising of either political or market-based types. And on what basis do we distinguish from things like propaganda versus actual education versus the kinds of things that indicate what my values are versus, just sort of a sense as to just not knowing about those things previously. So in this sense, we're asking, at what level does anonymity versus non-anonymity help us to make those kinds of choices, to even do the sense making, to be able to make those kinds of choices?
Yeah.
And then this is actually, like I said, it's a much broader question. It's a little bit like asking, how does perception work? How does the brain work? Like what do we do individually and collectively to know anything at all? So at this point, we're getting into questions of epistemology. What is the basis of knowledge? And what makes for, to some extent, really good information sensibility, to move from data to what we just called information to meaning? Like, what is the meaning of voting this versus voting that in the broadest possible sense? So when we're having conversations with our friends, obviously there's not anonymity between me and my friend. I actually want to know the person. I want to know what their basis of choice is, what their values are, so that I can understand how to interpret what they're saying to me. But at the same time, that conversation that's happening around the dinner table, I don't want that public, right? Because I'm still exploring ideas. I'm still, to some extent, looking at what are the options. And I don't want to commit myself to something I inadvertently say that I now have to be consistent with for the rest of my life. So in that sense, it's not just the question of anonymity and transparency between one person and another, but also between the group of my family versus literally every other family, or the group of my local community, which might be exploring these things in, say, little town hall meetings or something like that, versus, say, the next town over, which is exploring a similar but not quite the same issue. So in this sense, we really actually want both. We want transparency and we want opacity. We want to have freedom to explore without consequence as a kind of play. And we want work to actually matter. Work is something where what I do affects someone else and they care and depend upon what I'm doing. And play is the exact opposite of that. It's, I can do things and I don't have to worry about other people depending on it or being affected by the consequences, direct or indirect, intended or accidental of what I do, right? So basically I could say, if I want to do play, I need a certain amount of opacity. I need a certain amount of anonymity. And if I want to do work, I need a certain amount of transparency. I need a certain amount of accountability. And to some extent, I don't know, life needs to have both work and play, because if it's just one or the other, it kind of sucks. So in this sense, the question that you're asking is actually entangled with a whole lot of other things. Like I personally might say, this sense-making process and how to get the intermix between this transparency and opacity right is actually the deep question. It's a bit like, how do we get the relationship between symmetry and continuity right? Or how do we get the relationship between, things which are favoring a kind of, real ID kind of thing, so you don't have sock puppets without at the same time creating the risk of some totalitarian state coming knocking on your door because you happen to endorse so and so a person. Now, in this sense, these are deeply contrasting issues. It's a bit like the P versus NP complete thing in mathematics, or general relativity in quantum physics, in physics, which is these hugely deep divides. And so in effect, there's the toolkit with which we use to understand how to intermix these things and why they have this sort of fractal topology that divides them is one of those really profound questions. And the tool sets needed to address that are a little exotic. It's a bit like the Mandelbrot set. The boundary between the areas where you have convergence versus divergence are far from trivial. In fact, they're almost complete opposite of triviality. So asking about the question of, well, where's the boundary between P versus NP, or where's the boundary between opacity and transparency and cryptography, or the sort of issues that show up in marketplace dynamics as to what does good sense making versus what doesn't. These are deep questions. And while I can sort of hint at what the answers are, to develop the infrastructure to actually do so, it's a little hard to do just in conversation.
Fair enough. Do I have a question around consensus? Yeah, there's an interesting thing about consensus in terms of, on the one hand, taking the time we need to get on the same page about things, to develop a shared spirit so that we know what we want to technically implement when we come to the technical implications. But on the other hand, isn't there a risk that we sort of flatten ourselves out through our processes of exchange, that we produce a more homogeneous group spirit that loses some of the intelligence that's contained in our differences?
Oh, sure. I think that this is one of the risks of the consensus process. The one that was mentioned in the essay, of course, is that it takes a really long time. But the issue you're talking about of echo chamber effects, right, a kind of homogeneity of monoculture of thought and thinking. Yeah, this is part of the reason why so again, moving from the small group process to something that's larger. I mean, obviously with a small group, you're going to end up with, to some extent, entanglement, right? The people who are like one another will tend to collect and develop teams and families and so on. But when we're looking at slightly larger groups, say the size of a tribe, like 50 to 100 people, that to a large extent, you're starting to see the sort of edges where this diversity versus unitarity thing starts coming up. And so part of the way in which to address that is not to have everybody in one room all at the same time, like the consensus process would normally require. Instead, you break them up into smaller groups, and there's a kind of math to this, but optimally it's between around 5 and 7 people per small group. And they may have specialized roles, but preferred that it not be. And then in that sense, you have a kind of random intermix thing that allows people to go from one group to another, these smaller groups within this larger community or of concern, right? So in that sense, there really isn't an emergence of a kind of monoculture of thinking, that echo chamber effect, because it just never happens that there's everybody in the same room at the same time. And so in effect, you're ending up with all of these little petri dishes of sorts, and each one develops a sort of microculture for the time that meeting exists. And so you're ending up with evolutionary process kind of pulling away from this monoculture thing in all of these petri dishes. So if you balance the scale dynamics, and if you think about the intermix ratios rightly, you can have increasing emergence of divergent opinion, and at the same time, enough interplay of people moving from group to group and sharing ideas and so on and so forth, that you have enough convergence towards some sort of sense and sensibility as to what the group actually needs to do as a group. And so in effect, we can actually balance these two things, the need for diversity and the need for a kind of unitarity, solidarity for the group to be functional without getting entrapped in these, kind of cultish behaviors. So that's basically the answer to the question. It doesn't, there's not really much that can be done at small scales, but there's definitely something that can be done at intermediate to large scales. Once you get to really large scales, say, 5,000 or above, having any notion of solidarity becomes the challenge. Obviously, trying to create consensus for a group that large certainly isn't going to work with everybody in the same room at the same time, all basically waiting for one another to speak. So in this sense, there's by understanding the social physics of the group process and the ways in which unitarity and solidarity kind of compete with the need for diversity of perspective and the value of that, right? Obviously, we want that. Then there's this whole kind of emergent intelligence that can occur at a group level that is greatly in excess of that which is achievable by any individual. So this is basically the hope, and it's the whole reason why we would even look at governance architectures like this, because it has capacities well in advance of anything that is currently understood as democracy today.
Okay. In Wilber's style integral theory, there's this famous conceptual tool of the quadrants that show you subjective, objective, and singular plural dynamics so that you get these different epistemological domains. And some of those domains are about the individual and some of those are about groups. And there's a kind of open question in that community about whether a really good civilization looks like a civilization which all the individuals are wise, or whether it also requires the group processes to be wise, and to what degree the group cultivation of wisdom is analogous to the individual cultivation of wisdom. How correlated do you think those processes are?
I actually have really specific answers to those questions. The first thing I'll point out is that the quadrant model is incomplete. For example, there's the world, right? So I have individual, I have group, but then I have the entire rest of the planet, the other ecosystem aspects. So that's one expansion, but it might seem like a triviality, or, I'm just adding another column and have to think about that, but it actually has structural implications with respect to the question that you're asking. Because in order for me to understand what it means to be a wise individual, I don't mean just wise with respect to how I relate to other people, but wise with respect to how I relate to the world, which means I need an interconnection to self. I need to know what my values are. So in effect, the notion of wise connects back to success to some extent, and success connects back to value. So if I don't know myself, I don't even know what it means to be wise with respect to how I treat other people, or how I basically do things like drive a car or build something. So it turns out that each of these three connectives, to self, to other, and to world, have a kind of interdependency with one another. And so to really understand the dynamics of how does individual process act as a model for group process, effective group process, we basically need to understand kind of the architecture of mind, right? So in effect, not just thinking about, mind in the sense of some sort of esoteric subjectivity, but in the sense of neural architectures as basically being a model for biological process and ecosystems. So the question that you're asking is roughly equivalent to, can we understand ecosystems by looking at neural nets? And can we understand neural nets by looking at ecosystems? And it turns out, yes, you can. So in that specific sense, to the degree that one would recognize a deep connection between the math of evolutionary process and some of these other kinds of things, and I have to be a little careful here because I don't want to give hints that would lead to yet another existential risk. I would point out that there are deep connections. There are fundamental dynamics which are understandable about how individuals relate to one another versus how groups relate to one another, and how an individual and a group interrelate to one another. And so when I'm looking at the game theory, like most of the time when people try to answer a question like this, they go into some variation of game theory, which is great for thinking about actors and agents all at the same level. But the world isn't like that. I mean, people have behavior that is to some extent driven for individual benefit, and a whole lot of behavior that is actually driven to how do we participate in a tribe. And these are non-trivial biases. These are deeply integrated, fundamental organizational heuristics about not just our thinking, but our behavior as well, in ways that we're largely unconscious of. So to really understand how to see the connections between individual process versus group process, you have to know the individual biophysics of this, which is why that third column of world is actually important, because that's where that knowledge comes from. So in effect, what happens is that we can say, all right, back to the specific question of, do I need everybody to be enlightened in order for the group to be enlightened? No, I don't need one cell in my brain to be the seat of my soul in order for me to basically be intelligent as a person in the world. It's a distributed function. Every single neuron has a certain amount of intelligence, a certain amount of enlightenment, as it were. But on the other hand, the enlightenment of the whole system is greatly in excess of the just sum of the parts. There's a kind of multiplicative or exponential effect that is also showing up. And so the same is true at groups. And so in effect, when I'm looking at the process of this, I'm more concerned about what does it mean for a group to be enlightened? Even if it means that I don't need to have every single individual be enlightened. In fact, if I have to have a bodhisattva vow of every single person of perfect character in order for the system to work, well, that's not a very robustly designed system. In fact, it's probably a failure condition. So in effect, what we're basically saying is the emphasis needs to be on really good system design that allows for enlightenment to emerge at a group level, even if maybe even some substantial fraction of the individual people are actually just ordinary. And that's got to be a way to make, there has to be a way for that to work. And basically the work that I've been focused on is a response to that question. Like, how do we do that? What does that group dynamic actually look like that emerges a level of intelligence that is actually adequate to the needs to address things like ecological change due to anthropocentric process or existential risk, and not to do that anymore, right? I mean, that's not good, right? So in effect, what happens is that we notice that there are these certain absolute thresholds of intelligence which are required to solve large scale, hairy, audacious problems, chronic issues. And that in order to get to that level of intelligence, we can't do it as individuals. We have to get it at the group level process. So therefore, things like governance become very much the center of our attention, not as a be-all or replacement for culture and all the other good things of life, but as a functional necessity to address the things that we have the opportunity to live out our lives as individuals and groups at all. So, in effect, that's been much more the emphasis of how I think about things. I am definitely interested in having individuals be more enlightened, but I'm more specifically concerned with the conversational process.
Yeah.
And how the conversational process allows for the emergence of group enlightenment. And while I can use models to think about this, obviously game theory, I need to extend and have actually extended the game theory into multiple levels of agency, both with horizontal and vertical interactions. And that's, again, that's not a subtle thing to describe, but it is at least a pointer, an indicator of the kinds of directions that are absolutely needed in order for us to even address questions of the kind that you're doing. And that would be kind of my short answer, unfortunately.
Okay, let's talk about the what goes into scaling these conversational processes up, because it seems like there's two ways to think about that. One is you figure out a conversational process that works really good in a fairly small group, maybe a Dunbar or whatever we're dealing with. And you go, this is a cell and we need a whole bunch of these cells. And collectively, by using the same process, something will emerge at a higher scale. The other approach is to say that higher scales are fundamentally different. There isn't a one-to-one mapping, and you need a different kind of version of the process to handle it at larger scales.
That's right. So I'm more in the latter camp, but I have a lot of affinity for the former camp in a specific way. So we need to distinguish between principles, practices, and rules, right? So the principles that I'm using will basically create the practices that are specific to each scale, right? So as an engineer, if I'm designing a piece of software and I only need it to work for one user, I'm going to use different techniques than if I need it to work for a community of 100 people. And I will use, again, very different techniques if I need that to work for a community of 10,000 people. So each time I make a significant scaled step, an order of magnitude or two of process that this thing needs to be able to endure in, I usually need to re-architect. I need to rethink of the architecture of the process. But the structural architecture and the points of articulation and how to identify which ones those are to basically have the architecture that works at the next scale depends upon a series of principles which are enduring across all scales. So you need to have very clear awareness of these principles to be effective as an engineer to actually implement the scale process. Unfortunately, those principles aren't the kinds of things that you can learn very easily through what we would normally think of as empirical techniques, because, just on a matter of practice, going through one or two of these scales, as a design engineer and so on and so forth, and I've been through this transition a few times, it's not always apparent how to set up the architecture for the next one if you've got the architecture you've got. In fact, it acts as a kind of bias that prevents you from being able to see what's genuinely needed for the next one. So in a lot of cases, the people that are actually in direct exposure to these kinds of things tend to be the kind of people that mostly don't have the option of being able to think at these more abstract levels or even know the toolkit exists at, this kind of hyper abstraction that is the metaphysics. It's a different kind of personality that's really good at figuring out the sort of metaphysical implications versus the kind of, the ethical thinking, so to speak, and the social physics part versus the computer science pieces. So in this sense, what I would say is that very much there are ways to actually move through these scales. There are things that can be done. And a lot of that has actually been figured out. And again, this isn't very widely published. I'm trying to spend a lot of time getting articles up on mflb.com as kind of indicators. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to be published there in order to be an answer to the question for each of these scale levels. But honestly, there's a need for us to also stand back from scale, right? Because if we're looking to see what those principles are, to really understand them in their own depths, we need to understand a whole lot about psychology and anthropology in addition to this underlying math. So that kind of understanding is almost a discipline unto itself. And it basically means that one has to develop a kind of interior capacity before even thinking about the notion of scale. So yes, we can think about really good conversational process, and we want to live and implement that so that our own tool set of how we think about principle becomes enabled enough for us to start to move to the next level and really embody that one. Because without actually living at each of these individual levels and scaling too soon, we end up with the kinds of market force dynamics that pull things way off the principles, and you end up with actually things that are worse than doing nothing at all. The metaphor that I would usually say is, what would you rather have? The absence of a bridge and therefore no risk to life, or a bridge that's only 97% safe, right? You drive cars across it and everything's fine. You drive a bigger truck across it, everything's fine. And one day when you're in a hurry and you've got a big truck that just happens to be a little too heavy, you drive over the bridge and the whole thing collapses and you're dead, okay? Along with all the rest of the cars that happen to be on the bridge at the same time. Thing that is 97% reliable is for key things like, the infrastructure of all of civilization probably wants to be thought through to the point that it's really, really robust. I mean, civil engineering has error bars of at least 3 to 4 times the maximum amount anybody would ever think to use. And so in this sense, we have a need for us to get really robust with these principles and how they translate into practices at each scale level. Because quite frankly, there's an awful lot of dependency and weight on this. It actually matters. So in that sense, I see the rush to scale as often being as much driven by market dynamics. Oh, we want to make lots of money. I want to be on the ground floor and have lots of prestige. I want to, have all the fame and so on and so forth. Or, oh my God, the wave is coming. The tornado is on its way. The hurricane is happening. Global warming is around the corner. We got to do something right now. And so as a result, people get focused on the practicality issues to the extent that they're willing to cut corners on things like bridge building, like I just mentioned. So understanding the balance between the important and the immediate is crucial. Otherwise, we don't get that balance right, and things for sure will go off the path of sanity. Doing the same thing over and over again, immediate acute responses to chronic problems, never addressing why we had chronic problems in the first place, and could have maybe headed off in the past before it becomes acute and therefore very expensive. It's just a question of effectiveness. I mean, if I have to spend 1,000 times as much tomorrow because I didn't bother to spend $1 today, that's just nuts. I mean, and unfortunately, without the kind of conscientiousness at the conversational level and at the global level, we're kind of making mistakes like that unconsciously.
Does it seem plausible to you that people who take that time to be conscientious will set things up in a way that can compete with or even outcompete people who rush into strategy first procedures because they've got a head start and they started focusing on the things that make the effects? So
this is a key question.
Historically, it's given them a huge advantage. Can we outcompete them?
Well,
or is that the wrong question?
It's interesting. No, actually, it's the right question, because in analyzing that question, we understand the way in which it's the wrong question. And without doing that, we don't really know how to ask the right question in a way that really matters, right? So unless we can see what it is that's problem with that, and actually acknowledge the deep truth of it, like it's a bit like saying the truth. I'm sorry, the lie goes around the world at least twice before the truth even gets its boots on, right? So there are social physics dynamics that kind of encourage bad behavior or the kinds of things that are going on. So if we leave the social physics pieces unaddressed, then the biasing that, quote, advantages the fast, quick, inadequate approach against the correct approach. Well, as a heuristic, it works for a lot of things for which satisfying conditions are good. So we don't want to break it too much. But when we're dealing with existential risk, a good enough solution needs to actually be that, which means we can't just do the fast, quick thing and hope that it's going to be good enough. We have to know, because we only get one shot. If you're basically saying, my entire life is going to depend upon the roll of this dice, I'm not going to roll the dice. I'm going to pick out a pair of tweezers and I'm going to put them in a clamp. And I'm going to make sure that that dice very carefully lands on the side that's the one I need it to be. I'm not going to leave anything to chance, right? So in this sense, what we're basically getting at here is both understanding the system dynamics and the ways in which those system dynamics as they exist have some good features for a wide variety of things. And we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But then we want to know how to distinguish between the kinds of things where attention to detail matters versus the kinds of things where attention to detail is a complete waste of time. And without being able to know the difference between that, we don't know which regime of response we're in. That's basically the quick answer. In the place where we know the regime we're in, damn straight we can come up with competitive answers that will absolutely outperform, right? But if we combine all the domains together, then no, of course it never works, because, we're bringing out the hammer when we actually have a screw, and we're bringing out the screwdriver when we have a nail, and it just doesn't work. I mean, it's like, in this particular sense, to understand how to respond to things, we actually have to have encountered the true problem to know whether we're dealing with a screw or a nail. Then we can bring the right tool to bear, and of course we're going to have a much better response, and nobody's going to complain because it actually works. But now we need to sort of look at, what are the values? What is the unconscious value and the conscious value? How do we connect these things together? And when do we know which approach is applied to which? And getting clear about that kind of stuff, well, at that point, it gets obvious.
It seems like a lot of your approach to enhancing conversation involves a metacognition around values, a kind of self-awareness of people being able to recognize the values that are implicit in what they're trying to communicate and the values that are behind what other people are trying to communicate. You think that's fair?
That's fair. And it's largely a result of the fact that we're having a conversation. If we were in some sort of other interactions, such as, like I'm operating a tool in the wood shop, right? And my interaction is inherently of a physical nature, then the bias will show up differently. The metacognition will show up differently. It'll show up not so much in terms of values, but in terms of deep intimacy. I mean, I need to know, when I'm cutting a piece of wood, the forces that are moving through that wood, from the blade to the way the guides, and I need to basically understand the physics of literally everything that's going on. I'm listening, I'm paying attention. So embodied presence becomes by far the metacognition. If we're dealing with spiritual matters, again, there's going to be kind of a practicality element to it. I mean, in effect, you want to measure, like, I almost hate to say this as a metaphor, but if a religion is about enlightenment, well, how many enlightened people does it produce per month? And so what is the probability that you're going to go from unenlightened to enlightened with doing these practices, and how much effort is that going to take versus how much benefit being enlightened is going to have, right? So to some extent, we could say, well, I don't want to profane sacred things, but on the other hand, that's how we keep the sacred sane. Right. So in effect, I don't want to throw out the profane. I want to use it as a kind of checks and balances against insanity that might show up with a misunderstood notion of sacredness. And that's a different metacognition. So in this sort of sense, what the metaphysics is it's a toolkit that allows us to get clear about the fundamental dynamics of metacognition itself. And the practicality associated with that is frankly enormous. I mean, there is, without a doubt, to my mind, no tool set that has ever come anywhere close to the level of practicality that has already had in my life personally. And certainly for answering the kinds of questions that you're asking and the whole category of meta questions that go with them. So in this sense, mostly what I'm trying to do is to skirt the edge along the line of how much useful information can I encode quickly that will be available to you and to people that are watching this thing, such that it will make sense as to why it's worthwhile to ask deeper questions of this particular kind.
If we look around the world, there's a great variety of governance styles, right? We see that China looks,
actually, no,
variations among a few styles is maybe
variations, right? Yeah, minor variations.
Right.
Like if you look at the actual like scope of it, it's like the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, we can see this, but there's all these radio waves down here, and there's all this cosmic radiation at the right, and the 1 octave that we can see is like nothing compared to the whole deal. So that's how I experience governance. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fair enough. It's a nuanced phrasing there. Like, and I think it's especially true what you're saying in terms of national governance. Like, there's China's a little different than the EU, which is a little different than America. I think in corporations we see a few experimental trends. We see people.
If you're part of that culture, you see all the differences. Like, to someone in China. Yeah. Personality differences or style differences would be very obvious to them or completely opaque to us because we don't live there. And so in effect, what happens is that there's a sense here of within governance thinking, not just that they're in this spectrum and they can see the fine details of all these colors really well, but that they get the feeling that there isn't anything outside of that. Like when people say democracy, they literally have no idea that actually encompasses an entire spectrum of things. Which at this point, I'd say only 1% of which is even known.
Yeah, this is what makes me curious here, is because by like the ones we've instantiated collectively on this planet, there's not a great amount of variation. There's a little bit of, like I talked to Brian Robertson recently. So holacracy has been quasi-instantiated.
Yeah, they're pushing up against boundaries. Let's call that.
And there's 2%. Some very speculative ones, like, Jim Rutt's liquid democracy thing that he's promoting. There's a number of interesting ideas. What I'm curious is, do you see any that you think look significantly better or look like they're on the right track, whether it's in terms of proposals or in terms of actualities? Is there anybody who's doing a better job that stands out to you than anybody else?
I would definitely say that there are important differences. And so you're putting me a little on the spot here, because as soon as I answer this question, I'm now giving myself political alignment with one or another of these groups. I think there's a lot of good things to look at in the holacracy motions. There's this group out there called Holochain, which is thinking about commerce and the notion of currency in ways which I personally, and actually, they're thinking about cryptocurrency kind of stuff, but their work actually predates Bitcoin. And they've done some thinking about some of these issues, which I think is actually pretty insightful. It's worthwhile. I'm sure there's lots of works out there, all of which have important, useful features or elements of thinking and design which need to be understood for what they are. The difficulty here is a little bit twofold. One is that there's the projects themselves mostly compete with one another for the same idea space and the same practical implementation. They want to get, business contracts and actually see this happen so that there's some sort of thing happening with the project. So there's what I would basically say an insufficient amount of sharing going on between all of these different things, and a real tendency to find fault, to basically say, well, it doesn't work for this, or it has these problems, so therefore we'll throw the whole thing out. And obviously the baby bathwater problem is a known thing, but people still have this bias. And it shows up at social levels too. Well, that person has this opinion in this political area, so they have to be wrong about everything else. That silencing thing is just, it's bogus. So the main thing here is first of all, to account for those social, political, emotional, kind of rhetorical kind of devices. And at the same time, when looking at what are the good features, and obviously being aware of the problems, and how do we maybe recombine, take this from here and take this from here, and how do we fit these together? Now we're actually looking at what are the design principles that actually govern refactorings of that type. So again, it's a metacognition. There is not, to my knowledge, to my knowledge, I don't know of anyone else who's figured out those meta principles. And that's not something I like saying. I mean, to one extent, it's kind of a sobering reality, and it's also a lot of pressure, to be honest. So, in effect, I would strongly encourage people to recognize that there are real questions in the space of how do we exact architectures. The closest thinking I've seen in this space of kind of a more principled approach is Dave Snowden's work about the Cynefin framework and, complicated versus complex and what those imply. My framework is a little different than his, although I see there's a lot of value in what he's doing. There's places where I see a kind of polarization where I would use a trinity. And again, in the same way as the example before of going from, say, integral design and saying, well, it's not just about individuals and groups, but it's also about world. And the reification of the underlying dynamic of the ethics has implications with respect to understanding things like complexity dynamics. So when we're trying to essentially address practical concerns of actually making things happen by taking components from this system and these other systems and so on and so forth, the only way we're really going to be able to do that in anything other than a trial and error sort of way, which is, again, hugely expensive. An evolutionary approach takes a long time. And by the way, while it gives you good results over, say, maybe the next 3 centuries or so, well, actually not for governance design. For governance design, you're going to need 10,000 years, right, for evolutionary process to actually show up. So in this particular sense, with existential risk in the mix, we don't have that kind of time. We literally need to know how to get the refactorings right and to have a roadmap as to how to do that on the first try, because we only get one shot. So in that sense, there's a real need for deep principled analysis in the space of how to think about how to even evaluate existing systems of governance proposal and why some of those may be preferential to others, but really to stand back far enough to basically say, okay, all of these are operating more or less over here, but what we need is a point there. And how do we construct that? So at this point, I have to basically say there isn't anything on the map that I'm aware of that has the tool set necessary to get us into this space. But I will call out a few significant mentions. If people aren't aware of the work of Tom Atlee, they should be. His work is important. He's basically trying to think about democratic process, citizen assemblies, and things like that from a very practical first-person point of view of just getting stuff done on the ground. And so in that sense, it's actually pushing against that limit of what's currently known, but hardly anybody is aware that that's actually happening. So I would say between Dave Snowden, the sort of holochain kind of work and everything associated with that constellation, and the kind of work of Tom Atlee, those to me are kind of like pushing up against the cutting edge. Another work in that same space, the V Taiwan work, very, very worthwhile. Audrey Tang and that crew of people has put something on the ground which actually works. It's not a complete solution. It's kind of a hodgepodge of different stuff fixed together, but they've made good choices about what that hodgepodge needed to be. And although it's an advisory group to the legislation that's created actually responds to the advice. And as a result, I think you end up with a higher level of competitiveness on the global market because of these sort of factors that, if somebody were to basically do something stupid like change the system, that they would end up with something that was considerably less effective because their takeover was throwing away the wrong things. So that's just, those are all opinions, but they're careful opinions. They're qualified opinions. They have in this sense, based upon my extremely limited exposure to all of the important stuff that's happening in the world, these are the observations I can make so far on the basis of some of this metacognition stuff that we're talking about.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. There's an argument between there's an argument that people are inherently myopic and biased, and so we need objective overseers in our decision-making processes who aren't involved in the situation too much. Mm-hmm. But there's another argument that people who aren't experienced in an area and don't stand to actually be affected by the decisions will be unable to be smart about it, even if they're well-informed and well-intentioned. So
there's a both and here.
Yeah. How do we find that sweet spot between objectivity and skin in the game?
Well, first of all, I very much say it's a both and. I wouldn't reject either of those. I would basically say more of both of that. Thank you very much. Good. Yes. But actually, I would even add a third category, obviously, me being in triples and all, which is to say that it's not just about objectivity in the sense of measurement.
Right.
It's subjectivity in the sense of value. So in other words, we can't just focus on, the firsthand experience without having some notion as to what does that experience mean. And I can't think about the abstract theories or the map making that would be kind of the expert dispassionate objectivity without also having some sense as to what do we want, right? Because the experts will give us effectively a kind of, here's what you can do. And the people that are experiencing the thing is saying, wow, that hurts or that feels good. And, the notion of what feels good in the moment or looks good in the moment might not necessarily be what is good in the moment, but you're not going to get what is good from we can do this and we can do that either. So the system of what does health look like? What does holism look like? That's not the same kind of expertise as the sort of math that would go with engineering. So the expert point of view, which goes into this sort of narrow, clear advice about specific questions, and the narrow, clear awareness of the specific of what's happening right now, needs to be met with this generalist. What's the big picture? Why does any of this matter? And what is the holistic effect that combining this expert opinion with this on the ground truth is going to result in a motion that we can move forward with? So it's the topology of that conversation, which I think is the interesting one, which is a different question than the one you asked, but you can see it's an expansion. It's a generalization of that question. Without that generalist move, we're very likely to get caught in traps of over-optimizing for expert opinion, we're over-optimizing for stakeholder opinion, and either way, we're fucked. So in that particular sense, it's the reframing of what actually needs to happen here and the tool set that allows me to, by the way, notice this move, right? So for instance, when you present me with this question, what I basically do is I have this sort of constellation of concepts that basically says, oh, this maps to this and this maps to this. And oh, by the way, wait a minute, there's a hole here because this two things are part of this architecture and these two things are part of this architecture. So this hole should look like a hole over here. Yep, there's a hole there. And this other hole that's in this thing should look like a hole over here. Oops, there's a hole there too. All right, now we need to point out this part's missing and this is what it looks like in these two frames. And the ability to do that fast. Well, that's a result of just dealing with this for, I don't know, 3 or 4 decades now. So while I'm making it look easy, please understand that it wasn't easy to get to this point.
Sure.
So that's both an answer to the question and an answer as to why it's important to answer a question that way and how I arrived at a place of how I could even do that.
It sounds like in order to make the world work out better, that we need a really good set of principles that can give us a model that's applicable in a wide variety of circumstances. We need a whole bunch of people who are skilled in and understand the principles by which sense making and conversation can get to a much higher grade. Right. And we need a bunch of these generalists who are capable of mapping different high-level pictures of the world against each other and communicating on that basis, or depths, whatever we might call them.
Yeah, you want domain experts, you want stakeholders, and you want generalists that are empowered to be able to answer questions the way I just did, and to have the stakeholders and the domain experts understand one another. And so in this sense, it comes back to me of basically being, how do we do community governance? Yeah. And when we have this cell of community governance, how do we basically have federations of community? And the architecture of that might be different than the architecture of what makes a good community governance. And then when we think about larger scales, again, there's going to be a different mix, right, of what kinds of ingredients are involved, right? Because the ingredient stack you just described is really good for a team or for a community. But then when I get to thinking about federations of communities and what the mix of that needs to be, well, that's going to be on a different order and basis, different set of principles. Well, same set of principles applied to a different set of practices. I should be clear about that.
I have a curiosity that's around how, people ask the question, how far down does consciousness go and that sort of thing. I'm curious how far down collective intelligence goes, because we can see there's human versions and we can go, oh, there's sort of hierarchies of competence and fairness in some of the mammals, and then there's swarms and flocks. And if I go right down, I wonder sometimes if there's a quantum scale version of this, because most of the interpretations of quantum physics are, hey, you can't do a really precise calculation of where this thing's likely to be unless you take the information and the interactions of the information of all these other variants into account in the calculation.
And even then, not so much.
Yeah, but is that a way of saying that collective intelligence is at play? Does a swarm of electrons decide where the electron is going to be? Is it fair to call that collective intelligence?
This is an incredibly subtle question. If you're looking for the simplest possible one-word answer of, am I a pantheist, or am I some sort of notion of consciousness applied to even subatomic levels? Sure. I guess I would say that to a rough cut, I would agree with that notion. But when we start to think about how do choices get made, there are fundamentally non-deterministic elements. And this shows up super clearly when we get to quantum mechanics. There are, even if I knew the positions of every particle in the entire universe, first of all, the calculation that's involved becomes intractable. Secondly, even if it was tractable, it wouldn't provide enough information to actually make the prediction. There's an inherent indeterminacy written into the very fabric of being itself. There's a domain limit, basically, below which information just doesn't work. The data and information just doesn't work the same way. So in this sense, I would say that it's actually the case that when we think about consciousness, we can't do so without thinking about randomness and what would be called the temporal arrow, right? The fact that the future is different from the past. So in this sense, to really address these sort of fundamental ontological questions or fundamental epistemic questions, this is where the tool set of the axioms really comes to bear. And then in that case, we're really talking about the relationship between the subjective and the objective as being what we mean by consciousness. So, well, I guess these are hints. They're pointing to an arrow. I don't know how much you want to explore that, but that's at least the beginning. The relationship between the subjective and the objective is more fundamental than either the subjective or the objective. So I can't model things purely in terms of objective states. In fact, even the notion of model, I can't model certain things. There's certain things that are beyond the notion of model and system altogether. And knowing how to deal with the limits of that is actually part of the game. It's like I have the known, I have the unknown, and I have the unknowable. Yeah. And unfortunately, most of math and physics would assume that there's no such thing as the unknowable. But computer science is pointing out, yeah, there's actually things that are incomputable. And when people say, like Wolfram, for example, is referring to the universe and saying, the universe is a kind of computation. And I basically say, well, you could think of it that way, but then what do you do about all this non-computable stuff? And is your notion of model to be taken as such a sort of panacea that it's going to ignore the fact that there is hard random in the actual universe? These are getting into details, but I basically at this point would suggest that more than an omniscient mode of thinking about things in terms of models and math and physics is needed in order to address questions like, is consciousness real? How does the notion of reality distinguish itself from existence? And what does it mean to be objective? And to really understand the nuances of that real exist objectivity distinctions. Because without that, we're kind of chasing our tail.
I would love to have more of that conversation with you, but I would try to keep us on the socio-historical dimension for this conversation. One of the things that, I don't know if you have kids, but we've got a couple of preteens, so their curiosities and our anxieties and things often tend around this question of what does the middle of the 20th century look like? And I'm curious, what do you think are the inevitabilities and what do you think are the possibilities, over the next couple of decades?
Wow. Okay. Well, I generally try not to prognosticate too much because there's no easier way to look like a complete fool than to make predictions. Then I would say that to some extent I have some real concerns, right? So aside from the complete list of what we would call existential risk concerns, which I'm just going to take and put on the table because there's a lot of wild cards in that. I see, for example, a lot of trends, particularly here in the United States. I can't necessarily speak as well for the rest of the world because I'm not widely traveled, but what I can definitely say is that we find ourselves, I think, in a situation where infrastructure, which has been invested in a sense of like building roads and bridges and things like that the infrastructure itself is becoming more expensive to maintain and is actually already too expensive to maintain for the tax base that is using it. And replacing it is also too expensive. So what you end up with is this kind of slide into second world conditions. I think that the economic strength of the United States is actually not very good over the long term. And by long term, I'm speaking decades, because that's the scale you're talking about.
Sure.
And so, in effect, I feel that the main drivers are going to be things like more and more pressure to try to deliver more and more economic viability, but at the same time that the fundamental structural characteristics just don't support that. And that there's a kind of inevitability to you can't grow forever that is already showing up in towns and cities. There's a website out there called Strong Towns, which makes this argument, I think, pretty well. And there's a social political thing of, entitlement and expectation, which I think basically drives people also because, there's this sort of great cycle theory of, the grandfathers were in the war and they know how horrible it is, but the grandchildren don't. And so as a result, they make choices which lead to political brinksmanship that results in quite horrible situations because they have the expectation entitlements that they quote unquote deserve a reality that is economic prosperity forever. I think changing that mindset is a really important thing. Otherwise it's just going to be sheer pain. So in this sense, I guess you could see my general prediction, sort of an economic one. No economic sleight of hand or financial instruments or further disentanglement of Wall Street from Main Street is going to be helpful. I think to some extent that there's going to be a lot of political unrest driven by sheer inequality issues, and that those inequality issues are going to show up as, frankly, a lot of pain and suffering for a lot of people that is actually needless given the technological infrastructure and base that is available and present. So it's going to become a lot more about, I think, those kinds of pressures and how those pressures play out, which of course you can't predict because it depends sensitively on initial conditions and lots of choices made along the way. I think one of the main questions that I ask, like say, look at China, Europe, and the US. I feel that Europe is already irrelevant. The United States is increasingly irrelevant, and China is effectively taking over because everyone else is asleep at the switch. So then the question becomes, is their plan, if they have a 100-year plan or a 1,000-year plan, and we all hope that they do, because frankly, somebody needs to. And, is that plan sane? And there's a lot of reasons to wonder about that. And, I personally think that figuring out how to do good governance in order to come up with a sane plan is actually a big deal. So in this sense, it's kind of like, I would encourage some longer term thinking about economic fundamentals. And from that, develop a kind of political will and education and sort of just come home to Jesus conversation. I'm not religious, I'm just using that as an expression, but just to get real with the reality. Because otherwise everything is sudden to the blind. We're back to not being able to prognosticate things about things that we should be intelligent enough to actually do. I don't know whether reindustrializing the United States is the answer. I think to some extent we need to recognize that we need to move away from just economic ways of thinking about how do we solve problems. I'm not saying that economies should be replaced, that the notion of ownership is horrible, but I'm just basically saying that to some extent we're kind of like, a one-shot civilization because we have one set of tools, and we've gotten so used to those tools working so well that we've come blind to the fact that those tools don't work for the kinds of problems we're now facing. And that without developing an awareness of the other kinds of tools necessary to solve things like global warming and pollution and existential risk and all the other hazards of industrialized process, not to mention all of the inequities of social process, that we won't really know how to anticipate and make choices in the space of things like massive global economic shifts. To some extent, we're kind of coasting on our past successes. And I think that to really get a sense of how the future is, we either need to see what that coasting looks like and the slide downhill it implies if we do nothing, versus a real awareness and a kind of adult sensibility about what's needed to be done. We need to move away from adolescent responses to marketing for just purely sexual leverage to maturity in the sense of what is the right answer, in the sense of holistic, in the sense of addressing all of these concerns, not just economically or infrastructure, but going all the way down to the level of culture and getting culture right. If we start from a place of entitlement, we're certainly not going to get anywhere, because that's not going to, it just doesn't even allow for looking for new answers. So my hope is, this voice from way out in the nether regions of the wild maybe encourages a little bit more sense and sensibility in this space, so as to shift that future course. I don't like sounding pessimistic, but I would really love to see some traction for maturity, for wisdom as being a guiding force, not just political expediency.
I'm kind of prompted to ask a slippery question. It's difficult to formulate this question, and it's around your sense of the potential role that things that aren't normally considered part of reality might play in figuring out how to organize societies to be adapted to reality. Like, when we're talking about good conversations, should we be including UFOs, occult entities? When we're talking about the layout of cities, is power spots a relevant thing, right? If we're like, there's a whole set of human conversations about things that are usually considered to be paranormal.
There are elements of this
magical
question.
And do we need to factor that in terms of figuring out the systems moving forward? Or is it nonsense?
Let me disentangle a couple things.
Yeah, please.
Is there a need for us to consider the sacred when making choices? Yeah, definitely. Do I want to define what the sacred is or means? I will go as far as saying the world is sacred. The world is this planet and all the life on it, everything that's going on, you, me, all of it, is incredibly valuable, like well beyond most people's expectations. When we think about the total world economic output, you're somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 trillion per year, maybe 500. I don't know. It could be off by an order of magnitude. But when we think about the total value of the world measured in anything using the same ways, like the actual notion of value, the real, what would it cost us to rebuild this or replace this? We're talking somewhere in the order of $1 quadrillion. Our sense of value is way fucked up because we're just totally ignoring the real value. So sacredness needs to be a part of the conversation. Does it take the form of any of the things you explicitly named? Honestly, I have no idea. But when I get to what is the role of basically aesthetic concerns in combination, with what is fundamentally ethical concerns, I see those as having equal value. I think that to some extent, without having a real sense of aesthetics, so, we can have a conversation about what does it mean for something to be a power spot. And, that's a kind of category 3 question. But on the other hand, there's a kind of aestheticness to things like that. Yeah. And it's not just the aesthetic of, oh, I want to think about the world in terms of these kinds of things, but the aesthetic of those places usually are the most beautiful places. And if I go in with the sense of, oh, I'm going to pave this thing over, I'm probably going to wreck the beauty of it. And as a result, actually damage the thing that would have been the reason and the motivation, the the cultural value or the experiential value, firsthand spiritual knowing that would motivate us to make better choices in the first place. If life sucks, people basically say, I'm out of here. They commit suicide and stuff. So in effect, what happens is that we basically need to actually have good skills of preserving things that are already meaningful, already valuable, already beautiful. And unless we can actually appreciate the notion of beauty as itself, like really recognize what that means, our effort to civilize things is effectively going to destroy it. So in effect, I'm going to answer your question in saying there are wild phenomena. And whether you think of that as being wolves in the untamed wilderness or aliens floating by on spaceships, I don't care. But what I can say is that without some notion of appreciation for those things which are unconstrained, which are unpredictable, which are basically irrational, like love is irrational. If you give me a reason for loving you, and I'm basically supposed to love you for that reason, then to some extent, you really haven't actually experienced the emotional reality of love. And it doesn't have a reason. And if it did have a reason, it wouldn't be love. It would be love only for the fact of it being irrational. Which isn't to say that love doesn't have a practical element. It has, I'm choosing to enable your choices for your sake, right? I'm essentially allowing for your wildness to emerge in its complete manifestation so that I get to know you more as yourself. I want to appreciate your aesthetic. So if I go in and I try to tame you to make you more like me, we're back to that question of the consensus thing in the echo chambers. And that sucks. It's like, wow, I'm here, but this is far from beautiful. And it's certainly far from entertaining. It is boring, quite frankly, right? So in effect, I basically am not only affirming the sense of wild and affirming the sense of the irrational as much as I'm affirming the sense of the rational. I'm saying both are needed. If I want to get really too rational about ethics, I'm going to miss it. I'm going to come up with trolley problems and just completely misunderstand the topic. On the other hand, if I try to get rational about aesthetics, I'm going to end up with some sort of brutalism, right? And on the other hand, if I accept the irrational about the aesthetics and say, there are some choices for which I can't explain the reason. And there are some things for which, in the same way in ethics, it's kind of be like, this is my deep truth right now. And I'm responding from this. That is a kind of self-awareness and a kind of world awareness that basically goes a little bit beyond it definitely goes beyond just social awareness. And I think that if we try to define the entire world just in terms of social awareness, we are for sure not just throwing out all the aliens, but we're also throwing out all the wildness and all the beauty. So does that need to be a factor? Hell yes. Does it need to show up in the sense of conspiracy theory conversations? If that's what makes your culture come alive, then fine. I don't necessarily have a very strong opinion about some of these topics. I actually have quite strong opinions about other ones, but that's really a different conversation. It needs a whole different social geometry to even have the capacity to have that conversation. But those come back to aesthetic considerations. Is this an aesthetic of conversation from a point of view of compassion, a point of view of empathy, a point of view of relatedness? And is that safe enough to explore some of these wild edges, some of these places where we are not so sure that we know what we're doing? And can we play in that space well enough so that when we get down to actually do the work that we're doing is of higher quality? Yeah, you're not going to play very well if you don't know how to work, and you're not going to work very well if you don't know how to play. So yes, you need both. And so whether those things are real or not, I don't necessarily, again, want to indicate strong opinions about that, but I can definitely indicate a very strong opinion as to the need to consider such things.
That's, I think, a beautiful and very open place to bring this towards an end. And I'd be very happy to have more specifically philosophical or more specifically spiritual or more specifically other conversation with you in the future. That would be great.
Maybe a little less public.
yeah, maybe. Yeah, that would be great. Private conversation would be fabulous.
Because there is risk associated with talking about risky things, right? I mean, if you're exploring kind of the wild edge of abandon, then maybe you might want to say, I kind of want some support,
Absolutely. And I hope I didn't take us too close to
No, that's fine.
All right. Very happy to have gotten to know you a little better. I appreciated this. Obviously, enormous respect for the thinking you've been doing and the moral core of the way you've been organizing this thinking. I think it's fantastic. So thank you very much, Forrest.
Awesome. Great. Good to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I hope we'll chat again soon.